meeting, but this time is our first time, as Summer just said, with a member of Congress. So that's really cool. In the role that Summer just mentioned, FPC means Federal Political Coordinator. And according to this button here, that means in my role, my main responsibility is to be the liaison between our national and Congressman Boyle by providing him with information about issues in our industry, as well as advocating for his support or opposition to legislation in Congress. An example of our advocacy was last week's stimulus bill to fund the Small Business Administration and provide realtor unemployment insurance, which I'm happy to report to you the Congressman supported. So I'd like to introduce you now to Congressman Boyle, who has some information to share with you. Then to follow will be a question and answer session hosted by our CEO of the Philadelphia Association, Mr. Matthew Braden. So Congressman Boyle, if you will.
Congressman, a long time for the Realtors Association. I'm glad I was just able to join you. I had a little bit of technical difficulties, as all of us are starting to get a little bit better about working from home, but fortunately was able to join right in time. Also, I feel a little bit funny. This is a first-time experience for me. I've been in office 6 years, State House, and now I'm in my 6th year as a congressman. In my 12 years, this is the first time I have ever spoken to a group while wearing a hat. My hair is at unseeable proportions at this point. In retrospect, pushing off a haircut in early March, as I did, was a catastrophic mistake. So I am wearing my lucky Eagle Super Bowl hat, and I'm glad to make history with the Philadelphia Realtors Association. So let me give a brief review. And by the way, happy to answer any questions. I think we have a very substantive plan here for the next hour, and happy to get into any subject. Since we know what is dominating all else right now, let me just give a brief overview, if I might, for a few minutes before maximizing time for Q&A. We now, and it can get very confusing, and I think press in using different labels for different pieces of legislation, which only adds to the confusion. There have essentially been 4 pieces of legislation, coronavirus bills that you can call them, that have passed since the first week of March. The first one, we don't even think about now. It was a much smaller bill that was more related to some of the health aspects, including funding for vaccines. The second coronavirus bill, which now seems small, but at the time was not small, is the bill that extended paid family leave for those who either have COVID-19 or caring for a loved one with COVID-19. And there were a few other aspects as well, but just for simplicity's sake, that was the main part of it. Then the third bill, the big one, what's been nicknamed the stimulus bill, also called the CARES Act, that is the $2 trillion bill that we passed several weeks ago. That's the one that includes this PPP, essentially $350 billion for primarily for small businesses to be able to access what start off as loans, but for many will turn into grants, provided they meet the criteria of keeping folks on their payroll. There are many other aspects in that piece of legislation as well, including the direct stimulus payments of $1,200 per adult, $500 per child for all those who make under $99,000 a year or $198,000 per married couple. And there were other aspects as well, especially when it came to PPE, the protective equipment, and funding for hospitals. Then finally, the fourth piece of legislation was the one that I drove down to DC on Thursday to vote on. And that was essentially re-upping the small business lending part of the CARES Act, the PPP. Doubling, well, I say adding money, doubling it, adding another 300 billion plus, as well as additional funds for our cash-strapped hospitals. So in their totality, these bills, particularly the $2 trillion stimulus one, that third piece of legislation that I talked about, but all of them combined add up to my quick back of the envelope math to $2.7 trillion in a very short period of time. To put that into perspective, because these are such big numbers, people can sometimes lose sight of the magnitude. $2.7 trillion is approximately 4 times the original Obama stimulus during the Great Recession. That was $787 billion. It was controversial at the time. I think in retrospect, most economists would credit with helping save us from the depths of the Great Recession and laid the groundwork for what was up until recently the longest economic expansion in American history, 10 years, which obviously came to an abrupt halt recently because of coronavirus. But that piece of legislation, which was big, is only a quarter of the size of all of the measures that have been taken by Washington over the last 6-7 weeks. So that's where things stand now. That is what has happened. And as we get into Q&A, I can talk about, obviously, what I see coming down the pike, what might specifically relate to realtors, to the real estate industry. I constantly, I'm a Democratic legislator who actually has CNBC on in his office most days. And so I constantly watch the housing starts figures as well as the consumer sentiment figures to get an idea of what is happening in the industry. So I think those of you with whom I've had a relationship over the years know that it's an industry that I track pretty regularly, and is obviously one of the most important in our nation. The overall health of the economy cannot be divorced from the overall health of the real estate industry. It's just impossible. We saw that in the most dramatic sense a dozen years ago with the Great Recession. The circumstances of this financial calamity are obviously very different. Nonetheless, I know the sort of ramifications that they have for your industry, like so many others, are profound. And I certainly want to be able to do everything that I can to help. So sorry, I don't think I tried to leave that at 5 minutes. I think I went over by a couple, but that gives you an overview, essentially a 7-minute version of what has happened at a high level the last 6 to 7 weeks.
Okay, Congressman, thank you very much for joining us today. Jack Malloy, thank you very much for the nice introduction and for the explanation about your role and how it interplays with GPAR, as well as up to Congressman Boyle and how that impacts our legislative lobbying, as well as amplifying the voice of real estate here in Philadelphia, as well as for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So, Congressman Boyle, let's take a little step back before you got to DC. Let's talk about how you got to Washington, DC, and let this serve as sort of like an introduction to our members who you may represent, some of them you may not represent within their district. And I think it's important for folks to kind of get that background about how you got there and how you got to wearing a baseball cap on a Zoom chat with us. I'm follically impaired. I'm not like you right now. So I don't have that luxury that you have. But anyway, tell us a little bit about your background. Where'd you go to high school?
I didn't mean to offend the follically impaired community, so I apologize to my longtime friend, Matt. And by the way, I should have said this in the beginning. Matt does an outstanding job, has been a longtime resident of the Fox Chase area. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in the Olney section of the city, went to Cardinal Dougherty for high school, and then Notre Dame undergrad and Harvard's Kennedy School for graduate work, my master's in public policy. In terms of my political career, I mentioned a little earlier, I served for 6 years in the State House representing a district that was part of Northeast Philadelphia and part Montgomery County. So you're familiar with Northeast, well, of course, you're all realtors, so you know every neighborhood in the entire Philadelphia area, but the Somerton, Bustleton, Fox Chase sections, as well as a portion of Abington Township. And then in 2014, I won an open seat and it was actually a very big upset to succeed Allison Schwartz, who was the member of Congress for what was then the 13th district, a congressional district that represented about half of the district was in Philadelphia, the Northeast, parts of North Philadelphia, and then the other half was in Montgomery County. So I was in that district up until about a year ago when the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court dramatically redrew the state lines as an effort to crack down on gerrymandering. And as a result, my district changed substantially so that I lost the Montgomery County half of my district and then picked up a lot more of Philadelphia. So essentially now I represent all of Northeast Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, east of Broad Street, and go as far south as Race Street. So roughly parallel with the Ben Franklin Bridge. So that's just about 1/2 of the city landmass and almost 1/2 of the city's population, 47%, for those keeping score. So so that gives you an idea of kind of my geographic footprint. Now, in terms of Congress, you know, I've really been, my first 2 terms, I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and did a lot of work in the foreign affairs realm. I then had the opportunity to, last term, or this term in which I'm serving, to be appointed to the Ways and Means Committee, which is one of the 3 exclusive committees. It's actually the oldest committee in Congress, the most senior. All of the tax code, all of our aid policy runs through the Ways and Means Committee. So obviously it's a very competitive committee to get on, and was very fortunate to kind of win that internal competition and get appointed to it. And so it ends up meaning that the work that I do now, I mean, there isn't a major piece of legislation that doesn't go through the Ways and Means Committee in some capacity, include on these stimulus, on these coronavirus bills. I had a role in crafting some of the provisions over the last several weeks. So, oh, and finally, my wife and I, we live here in Northeast Philadelphia in the Somerton section with my daughter who is 6 and who hopefully you won't be able to hear. She's in the other room doing her school lessons on laptop, and hopefully she won't make an appearance.
So on our chats that we've been having, as Summer mentioned, we've had a series of these going on over the last few weeks. We've had some interruptions through homeschooling challenges and some guest appearances by children. So it's always welcome to get a little splash of what's really going on. And along those lines, how are you and your family making out? How are you guys making out with this whole lockdown?
Thank you for asking, and doing well. I mean, look, we're fortunate that we're healthy, and I hope everyone on this call, that all of you and your loved ones are healthy as well. That's really the most important thing. My daughter would be at school in her kindergarten class in normal times, and my wife is a teacher, and so she would be at school teaching. So she's now teaching online the same time our daughter is learning online. So I think it's really been a challenge for a lot of us who are 2 working parents with a school-aged kid. So it's something when people talk about that, I'm very empathetic from kind of firsthand experience. While at the same time, I think for those of us who are around the same age, we also have parents, or at least one parent, who might into that older category that obviously have to be concerned about, since we can't physically be that close. I mean, this is a really challenging time for our entire country. And you know, I'm very mindful of that as we move forward.
Okay, so folks, if you have questions, drop them into the chat, and then what we'll do is we'll try to weave them into the conversation here with Congressman Boyle. So as we've done in the past town halls, that's kind of how we've operated, and it's worked out pretty well. So Congressman, just going into your actual office and the work that's going on with your office, how are you guys handling that? What's the remote setup, and how are you getting all hands on deck?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I pass along for all of you as individuals, as perhaps constituents, but also if you have clients or colleagues or just neighbors who find yourselves in need of help, it's good to know that our offices are physically closed but still open. So I have 4 district office locations, one in the Broad and Girard area of North Philadelphia. It's actually on Girard Avenue. One in the what you could call the Port Richmond section, one in the Olney area, and then one in Northeast Philadelphia. That's where they physically are and where folks would typically go. Obviously, those have been closed for the last month or so, but all of our folks are still working virtually from home. And so via phone, via Zoom, via email, via text. And ironically, I was just looking over the figures last night. My district director, Scott Heppard, does a wonderful job running the operation when I'm in DC. Last week, we serviced more constituents than any single week that I've been in office. So even though our offices are physically closed, we're actually busier than ever. And it intuitively makes sense. Unfortunately, people just have a lot more needs today and have a lot more questions and a lot more really weighty sort of issues than they did pre-coronavirus. So anyone after this wants to get a hold of me, has a specific issue, is applying for PPP and is running into a problem with the FBA, boyle.gov. All of my contact information is there. Also, we created a site entirely to coronavirus, kind of the sort of information that our constituents would most likely need. So I encourage you to go to boyle.gov if you have any questions or need to reach out to us. The information is there for you. And fortunately, we've been up a lot of people through this.
Can you repeat that address for us again, Congressman?
Yes, it's my last name, boyle.house.gov.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. So relating to DC, how often do you have to go down there, and what's the setup for doing regular congressional business? I know you guys have been doing some remote stuff, it sounds like, but how's that going on with the floor and votes and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so over the last month, 6 weeks, however long we've been out, all of our meetings have been via conference call. Like yesterday was a 2-hour conference call late yesterday afternoon. Had Bill and Melinda Gates on for about 45 minutes of it to talk about the funding that they're doing for the different sort of vaccines that are in development. There are approximately 8 or so right now that are all in this sort of competition to be the first to succeed. But that's it. I have never been on more conference calls. Probably you're all the same. I've never had conference calls over the last month. If you take all of my years, I'm 43, so take the previous 43 years of conference calls, it still doesn't stack up the last 6 weeks. So that's how we've been doing work almost exclusively. And then physically going to Washington when there's a bill to vote on, which is like last Thursday, hopped in my car and drove down. Now, we were supposed to return, and it was announced last night that we were returning next Monday on May 4th. Literally right before this meeting started, I got a text that the Capitol attending physician has intervened to prohibit that from happening. So right now, as I speak to you, there's a little bit of a lack of clarity as to whether or not we're physically going back next week. It looks like next Monday is now off.
Is that breaking news? Is that breaking news that we have here?
Literally at 11:29, right as I was attempting to get Zoom to work, that announcement was made, which is a total reversal from what was announced last night. So once I'm off our meeting, I'm going to find out more about that. But in my view, and I have advocated for this strongly internally, as have others of my colleagues, we have to set up some sort of ability to meet virtually if we can't be there in person. Conference call is fine and better than nothing, but we are voting on such major pieces of legislation, and at least those votes have taken place in person. But we do know that as people, not so much for those of us from the Philly area, but for those who are in places further away from Washington who have to get on a plane and at this point go through various airports. One of my colleagues from Florida, who's typically a direct flight away from Washington, now has to take 4 different connecting flights just to get there because of the lack of air flights. Given that, we do need to set up, Congress needs to set up some sort of ability in a secure way to meet virtually. And I think that this crisis has really exposed a weakness in our system that you should be corrected after September 11th. And I think it's a real fault of Congress, the folks who were serving in the years after 9/11, 2001, that wasn't set up, because I think that whole system has been exposed and we need to correct it now for this crisis, but also we know that eventually there will be others. So I do expect that that is ultimately something that you will see come out of this.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's get into these various packages that you mentioned in your opening monologue. And, you know, like you said, $2.7 trillion worth of spending. Where will some of that be coming back to Philadelphia? What will be happening with Philadelphia? Where will the PPP go to here? Where does that all line up with your constituents and what can happen here for Philadelphians?
Yeah, so let me, actually, I'll give you the exact figures, because I mentioned the 300+ billion for PPP, again, that's the SBA program. So this is what was in the bill that was passed on Thursday. $310 billion in new PPP funding. So that program, which had run out of money, could restart. $65 billion in funding for the frontline PPE purchases. That's the personal protective equipment. $25 billion in funding the COVID-19 testing. The lack of testing has probably been the single biggest failure of the American federal government throughout, and is something that we need to dramatically improve if we're going to be able to get back to some semblance of normality. And then there were a few other more minor things, but so those are the exact figures. Now, how does the Philadelphia area benefit from that? First, a bill of that size, given that we are, depending on the statistical measure used, we're from the 4th, 6th biggest metro area in the country. We're the 4th biggest media market, 6th biggest metro area, according to the Census Bureau. There is no way that a community like ours would not benefit in some way from that sort of large spending. Here are a few areas specifically. Some of the hardest hit hospitals in the state, actually the 2 hardest hit in the state, are both in my district. And Temple University Hospital in North Philadelphia and Einstein Hospital in the Almy section. Those 2 hospitals have more COVID-19 positive patients than any other in the state. they will directly benefit from the PPE provisions. Anyone who is a small business owner who decides to apply for the PPP funding will, of course, benefit. I strongly encourage anyone who is interested in that program to apply now. I mean, literally today, because I am concerned that as much money has been now devoted toward that program, the original 350 billion, now this additional 310 billion. Believe it or not, we still might hit cap and run out of money because there is such demand. So if any of you are interested in that program, I strongly encourage you to apply literally today. So that generally is the way that the Philadelphia area will benefit from this, as will every other area in the country. Proportionally, have a larger percentage of our economy that's derived from what's called the meds than other areas. So the med part of that will benefit our area more than would benefit others that don't really depend on that as such a large part of their economy. Final thing I'll say is earmarking was banned by Congress 10 years ago. It was a reform that was in place, I think, frankly, an unwise reform. Were abuses to it that ended up scrapping the whole idea. Like the old days when you could say, all right, I'm voting yes for this, but I want 25 million to go to XYZ hospital or cancer center or something like that. That can no longer happen the way it did in days of old.
So you mentioned about in your district, you have 2 hospitals that have the largest amount of patients in the entire Commonwealth, not just in the city. What has your interplay been with Governor Wolf and Mayor Kenney? I'm sure there's been some conversations. Could you give us a little bit of insight into those conversations and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I actually, Jim, the mayor called me last night. We've been in constant communication. The city of Philadelphia budget, like all of our city, like all of our states, has been absolutely devastated. I mean, look, most city governments and most state governments derive most of their revenue from taxes on economic activity. And so when you have a dramatic drop in economic activity, budgets that were projected to be surplus quickly become deficits overnight. So the mayor and I have been in contact about a lot of things. Originally, we were in contact over the course center and that issue. That was more the case about 4 weeks ago. More recently, we've been in contact about different priorities the city has that he wanted me to advocate for in Washington that I was happy to do. Delivered a multi-page letter to the Speaker of the House on behalf of Mayor Kenney just about a week and a half ago. Haven't been in as much direct contact with Governor Wolf, but certainly have had frequent conversation where appropriate with members of his administration. But most of the sort of things that I'm working on, are more directly involve the mayor than actually the governor. But in my view, our local governments, our state governments, they absolutely need help from the federal government, and there just isn't a choice here. Most operate under balanced budget amendments, 49 of the 50 states, and they don't have the ability to print money. So if from the federal government, won't come from anywhere. And what that means is, you might say, well, funding for state government, who cares? How does that affect me? Well, very much does, because where we have firefighters, where we have other institutions, SEPTA, where we have people at the state level, they would be directly affected if suddenly state pay the bills.
So talking about the state, and you mentioned testing earlier, it sounds like Governor Wolf's plan is going to be depending upon testing, you were mentioning about getting more money here for testing. Any idea about the interplay between those two different things? And can you look into your crystal ball and see any kind of idea of when we might be opening up some sort of business in this section of the Commonwealth? You know, I know Governor Wolf has the red light, green light, yellow light set up.
Right.
What are you seeing and hearing there?
So let me quickly nationally in like Pennsylvania. The first thing is there's no question that the lack of readily available testing has been a substantial problem, especially when you compare us to other countries. Those countries that are on the path of reopening, like Germany, are further along. That it's needed is because if we have readily available tests, we would then be able to isolate the people who are afflicted, not impacting the rest of society. So as long as we don't have that ability, it means we have to have widespread closures more than we would otherwise need. And I think at this point, most people sort of, understand that. Now, in terms of locally, fortunately, we're not in the same boat as New York or New Jersey, but unfortunately, out of the state, the area that has been the most impacted has been ours. Started off really in Montgomery County with that was the first place in our area, actually the first place in the state to show dramatic numbers. And then it spread to Philadelphia. So the governor's indicated we will probably be the last area to come back online. I still think, though, that there is, and this is the case whether it's nationally or in our region, I have to say there is a big question mark about what the quote-unquote new normal will look like. And there are many different views on that. So I wish I could more clearly answer the question, but the reality is anyone who tells you this is what it'll look like, this is what we've determined, it's just lying. We still don't know. There's still dramatic variants of what the models show. We had thought a few weeks ago, I mean, not me personally, but folks in the administration had thought that the 60,000 figure was going to be the number of those who would unfortunately die because of COVID-19. That was based on the most optimistic model, which was from the University of Washington. We're about that 60,000 figure perhaps by the end of this weekend. Clearly, that 60,000 figure was wildly and overly optimistic. What kind of situation of new infections will society be willing to tolerate in order to go back to work, in order to go back to some semblance new normal? Will that new normal mean restaurants open, but tables are much further apart? Will it mean barbers, which I very much hope will be able to reopen soon, but it means no one sitting in the lobby, perhaps someone waiting outside or waiting in their car. There are these sort of things that still have to be figured out, and they really haven't been yet.
Yeah. So we were talking about PPP earlier. One of our questions in the chat gets into, there's clearly been some frustration with that, and seeming that maybe some businesses were recipients that shouldn't have been. You foresee any kind of provisions or any kind of thought going forward about being a little bit more tighter with that stuff so that there isn't misuse and things along those lines with PPP?
Yeah, I think that whoever asked that question is 100% right, and I share that concern. I mean, when I see some of the larger businesses and even institutions that chose to access those funds, now, fortunately, I think they've gotten to bad GPAR backlash that, they come to their senses on, at least some have. But, I can't say I'm totally surprised. Again, to go back to the analogy of the Great Recession, do you remember TARP, the Troubled Asset Program that was very controversial? It was seen as bailing out the big guys, bailing out Wall Street, which had gotten us into the mess of the Great Recession. That was passed, actually it was rejected. A week later it was passed. That was late October. The Great Recession had started in mid-September. It took about 6 weeks. This stimulus bill was written and passed within 1 week of really the coronavirus setting in as a big event. And I knew at the time, actually, this was in my press release about it, I had no doubt that it was done so quickly and with so much money that it was just inevitable that there would be unintended consequences in there, that things that people thought about, not enough protections put in place. However, even with that, the necessity to get out as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, really took precedence over doing something more targeted way and something that would just take longer. So that's the trade-off, and I think that it was, neither are perfect options, but I actually think in order to get that money out as quickly as possible, it was the right thing to do. Imagine if, even with its faults, imagine how much things would be worse if we didn't already do the $350 billion in small business lending, or the hundreds of billions that went toward the direct stimulus payments of $1,200 per adult and $500 per kid. Things are obviously very bad now. Our unemployment rate is probably somewhere in the high teens, but they would actually be that much worse had Washington taken time to neatly tailor a better bill.
So what do you guys see, or what do you see happening in DC with like the next phase? What are the potential next steps? And do you have any thoughts about what Congress may need before taking those next steps? What kind of information do they need? Is there anything related to vaccine treatment and effectiveness and infection rates? Does any of that kind of go into the matrix of what the next steps are going to be? Because as you just mentioned, things happen very rapidly. You're just trying to throw a whole lot at a problem and get it running, get it flowing, and then work out the details. Your ceiling looks really great, by the way.
Yeah,
some nice light fixtures up there.
If you need to show my house and you need to recommend any changes,
we'll get in the virtual
we have
tours.
a tight budget.
Yeah.
We have a tight budget in the Boyle household, so that won't happen anytime soon. As Jack knows, we moved into our house 10 years ago, and some of our plans of 10 years ago are still on the drawing room board, but still on the drawing board. But anyway, in terms of what happens next, I can't remember if it was Mark Twain or Yogi Berra who once said predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. And I think that all of the above is needed. First, I do think that we need more in terms of direct stimulus payments into people's pockets. That is the simplest, quickest way to provide people relief. So that's number one. Number two, this second round of dramatic PPP spending, essentially the small business lending, might also run out. So there might have to be a third round. I would expect that. Funding for state and local governments has to be in the next piece. And there's good news and bad news of this. The good news is all of the bills that have passed thus far out of Washington have been overwhelmingly bipartisan. One of them was unanimous. The $2 trillion. Imagine if I would have predicted a few months ago that a $2 trillion spending bill was going to pass, and you were going to get everyone in Congress to vote yes, from Ted Cruz to Bernie Sanders in the Senate, and from the far right to the far left in the U.S. House. That would have sounded crazy, and yet that is what has happened. And so even with all the talk about partisanship in Washington, the fact that folks came together and were able to pass out a large, meaningful bill, I think is important. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, unfortunately, this issue of helping state and local governments has recently become partisan. the president, as you probably saw, labeling it a quote unquote blue state bailout, somehow inferring that it was because of bad spending practices that certain states are now in the hole. That's just absurd. Actually, most state budgets were very much in surplus until coronavirus hit. It's also very ironic because states like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania actually pay more in federal taxes than we get back. So I think it's unfortunate that the administration and Senate leadership has recently injected partisanship into this issue. I hope that that's just bargaining posture and that they will come to their senses. We cannot afford to have a dramatic round of layoffs of teachers and other workers who are funded by our state and municipal governments. Can you imagine if suddenly in the middle of this, the city of Philadelphia went under and was laying off a bunch of cops and a bunch of firefighters? And that would be insane. So that has to be, one way or the other, that has to be in our next bill. I also think that when it comes to saving the post office, it is our constitutional responsibility to have a post office. A lot of people don't realize the post office was written into the Constitution by our founding fathers. It is that important. It actually operates without taxpayer help at all. It is a part of the government, but it's independent. Where they do run into difficulties is this arcane provision that was passed 15 years ago. And sorry if this is more information than you wanted, but the post office is on the hook for prepaying 75 years worth of pension obligations. You wouldn't see that anywhere in the private sector. If they just had relief from that provision, they would actually be flush with cash. Because as I mentioned, when it comes to operating budget, the post office does quite well. So those are some of the things. Oh, one final point, and it's not financial, but I think has to be. We need to have an election this November, and we don't know what society is going to look like come the fall. We might be over coronavirus by then. God willing, there might be a vaccine out. I think most projections would show it wouldn't be ready by fall, but who knows? A lot of innovative work is happening right now. Some of the brightest minds throughout the world are working on this. So perhaps the expectations we would have a vaccine by January optimistically end up being sooner than that. On the other hand, we might be in just as bad, if not worse, situation come October and November than we are now. And in fact, that is what happened during the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919. In many places, the second round of the Spanish flu was actually more deadly than the first round. So given that, and given the constitutional obligation to make sure that we have elections this November, for the presidency, for every seat in the House of Representatives, for a third of the US Senate, for our state legislative seats, we need to make sure that every state has the ability that Pennsylvania has, and that's the ability to vote by mail if you choose, as opposed to going and voting in person. Personally, I always like person. I've always voted that way. But this June, and for our Pennsylvania primary, will be the first time that I vote by mail. And I would much rather the ability to by mail than to not vote at all. Some states like Colorado, you only vote by mail. They switched to a vote by mail system a long time ago. But we need to make sure that the sanctity of this fall's election is upheld. So it's a long list, as you can see, but those are all things that I think need to be and will be addressed by future COVID legislation.
I think last year was the first time I ever voted via absentee ballot, and that's because I was doing a Hill visit to your office with NAR during the mid-year meetings. So that was a weird, different experience, because it's usually pretty cool going into that ballot box. So before we get into real estate specific questions, we have a couple more things here with PPP. Do you think there's going to be some kind of review? Obviously, that's what Congress does. There's always reviews of stuff. So I guess it's hard to not foresee some kind of review of how this PPP stuff, funding, came down the pike, who got what and who didn't get things, because we have a question in here saying less than 5% of small businesses received the funds. Any idea of what percentage of those had no right to actually get the money? And I think that's probably going to be one of those things you guys take a look at somewhere down the road.
Yeah, Matt, you're right. There will be a review. And in fact, I voted for it. So we voted 2 pieces of legislation on Thursday. One was the one that I mentioned, essentially the 4th coronavirus bill, which I've talked about. But there was another piece of legislation that I voted on Thursday, and that was to create of specifically these funds that have been allocated. It will be chaired by Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who is the House Whip. And I think that is entirely appropriate. One of the things that the Constitution requires of Congress is to provide oversight. And I think it is very much needed when it comes to these funds. And so that will happen.
Okay, so let's get into kind of what's in our wheelhouse here with our folks, our members. The real estate industry. What kind of things are you seeing? What are your concerns as it relates to housing here in the Philadelphia area?
Yeah. So let me just talk about what is already, because people might not be aware. And so let me provide some of this information that was in the 3rd package, which has also been nicknamed the stimulus bill or the CARES Act. It did provide for housing rental assistance, $4 billion for grants for those who are homeless or at risk of being homeless, $3 billion in rental assistance, and a 120-day moratorium on evictions and properties receiving any federal assistance. It is now this is where the negotiation took place. There was a House Democratic proposal that was much richer in terms of housing assistance. That the numbers I cited was what ended up in the final bill that passed, that looked more like what the Senate side wanted. Originally, the Senate bill didn't have anything on the housing side. So this is where it ultimately came down. In my view, that there has to be provisions in future legislation as they relate to housing. As we know, Friday is the 1st of the month, so mortgage payments will be due. Rent checks will be due, which matters not just for, of course, the tenant who's renting, but also the property owner who might actually be financed on that property. So, which I know firsthand, by the way, having been a real estate investor myself. So, in my view, future legislation will have to include some more funding when it comes to those housing related programs.
Okay, so we've had some interesting questions also pop into the chat here. School openings. Have you heard anything about the future of Pennsylvania education, or we just shut down for this school year and we'll worry about the fall at a later date, I'm guessing?
Yeah, so I obviously have a strong personal interest in this question as a parent, and as I mentioned, my wife is a teacher. We are as in the dark as everyone else. Obviously, this school year has been shot. That decision was made, quite some time ago now, at least here locally in Philadelphia and in the surrounding counties. What September looks like is now the big question. I can tell you that has not been figured out. I briefly talked about it with the mayor a couple days ago, and I can say definitively nothing has been decided on that.
We have a question about supply chain. So this is interesting. We saw the outbreak in South Dakota with the Smithfield pork processing plant, where there was a high level of outbreak there. Was that Sioux City, I think, or something like that. And now we're seeing it in Delaware and some other places near us as it relates to poultry. Any concerns about supply chain, and where does the federal government get involved with that?
So this is complex. I thought the question was going in a slightly different area, because when it comes to supply chain, I think this whole experience has shown how exposed we are, specifically to China. But frankly, and this is something I happen to be working on with the Ways and Means Committee, as well as one other colleague, some of these essential things, which I would obviously include masks in that category, a certain percentage of them, we need to make sure are manufactured in the United States of America. And this has been an issue that I've talked about before this, that we need to build things in America, that we need to fix how overly reliant we've been. And I say this, look, I'm not an anti-trade person by any means. I voted for the revised USMCA. We do need trade. We are under 5% of the world's population. We need access to the markets of that other 95%. However, as this experience has shown, we become very vulnerable when so much of essential materials are manufactured in a different country, especially if that country might have certain hostilities toward the United States and toward the American people. So that aspect of the supply chain, I think, needs to be addressed. Now,
is there something, Congressman, is there something that you guys could do to help change that dynamic?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm working on right now actually would specifically relate to the tax code, and using the tax code to incent production here in the United States of those sorts of materials. Obviously, we have the Defense Production Act, which means, during extreme circumstances like this, you can mandate that companies produce certain materials. I have been vocal in calling on the president to enact the Defense Production Act. I still am not quite sure why he was unwilling for so long to do that. But, that's sort of for extreme circumstances. I would think when things return to normal, we still need to use the tax code in a way that would help make it easier for certain products to be created domestically. So yes, we can do something about it. And in fact, the tax code, as we know, is a highly effective tool when it comes to incenting some sort of behavior and disincenting other sort of behavior.
Okay. Folks, you have any more questions, please throw them into the chat. So what do you think we need to do? What do you think Philadelphia is going to need to do to move forward? What do you think our next steps are going to be? As you said before, we don't know what normal is going to be like. We're not sure how things are as we progress out of this kind of lockdown phase. But what do you think we're going to have to do to come clear of this crisis that we're in?
Yeah, one of the things, I'm just looking over some of the things that I'd written, or that the mayor had written in his letter to the speaker that I forwarded along and added my name to. Let me take a step back and just try to summarize those. One of the challenges specifically for Philadelphia, city of over 1.5 million people, more than 20% of whom are under the poverty line. So if you do the math on that, more than 300, the population of poor Philadelphia is greater than 300,000. That in and of itself would be the second largest city in Pennsylvania. Poor Philadelphians. So it shows you that, and I'm, I don't, as I've said to Jim, I don't envy him, because I think some of the challenges that Philadelphia faces are really different and more profound than many other places in the country, and certainly other places in the Commonwealth. The situation in Abington and Rydell, or right next door to me in Huntington Valley, is, or even here in Somerton, is different than my constituents who are tightly close together in North Philadelphia. So that has to be always in the forefront of one's mind when talking about what things will look like for the city in terms of returning to normal, especially as they relate to schools and public transportation. So, I would go back to, in terms of how we can move forward, until we can make the testing readily available, until it becomes routine to take people's temperatures. I see airlines are now starting to do that. Those are the sort of practices that need to become routine in order for us to get back. I mean, look, I'm now, while it was, pretty annoying a couple of weeks ago, I actually now have gotten in the habit of, anytime I need to run to Wawa to grab something, I have my mask, I put it on. And I have to say, within a couple of weeks, I've gotten used to it. And so those are the sort of things that that we really need to get in the practice of, if we're going to get back to normal.
So going from the chat here, how does someone apply for PPP business loans? I think that's a quick answer, right?
Yeah, so the SBA has a website that makes that fairly straightforward. If you want access to that website, or you're not sure what to do, go to boyle.house.gov. We have right there where you can find it. If you have any questions, email us or call us, and we can help you.
Okay, going into the chat once more. So obviously, you have some pretty progressive colleagues in Washington, D.C., and maybe a little bit bent towards being anti-corporation, or at least that's the way the perception is of some folks. How does that interplay with trying to get corporations to do more things locally, nationally, and giving them incentives? How will that play with that sector of Congress?
Well, I do have some very progressive colleagues. Also have some very conservative colleagues as well. So, despite that, though, I would point out again that even on very big pieces of legislation, we've been able to reach some dramatic compromises. So I don't get too concerned that, while it's always a factor that you don't want any person or group to be obstructionist, it's not a major concern I have moving forward. I will say that moving forward in a way that we ask more of those corporations that have done well, but at the same time is not punitive, that to me is the sweet spot. I mean, for example, some of our grocery food workers are taking enormous risks and yet still only making a pretty small wage. Those are the sort of things that I do weigh in on, and I'm quite vocal that we do need to raise wages when it comes, and that's just one example, when it comes to grocery workers. But when I advocate for that, I don't do it in an anti-business way at all. Frankly, a great event in the United States. And thank God, entering this, we've always had the number one GDP in the world, and we had a strong economy entering this, which is very fortunate right now. If we were in a weak spot going into this, we would be that.
Okay, I think
I would say I'm not too concerned, and I have to say that those who might want to quote unquote play politics, fortunately, I think the recent experience has been that actually there's been very, very little of that.
All right, Congressman, I think we've used up all of your time. We're going to hand it over to Summer Job to wrap things up for us. I want to thank you very much for the time you gave to us. One last thing that I want to mention. When Congressman Boyle was running for his first elected office, one of the things that I think did was a signature mark of his campaign, and did this 2 times in which he lost both of those times, handwritten notes. He would knock on doors. So he was knocking on door after door after door. And if he didn't catch the homeowners while they were there, he would leave a handwritten note. And I must have received, I don't know how many love notes from then candidate Boyle. But it's that little stuff that makes a connection with folks. And I think that that's something that all of our members can take It's about making those connections with people. It's a relationship business. And sometimes those little things go a tremendously long way. So that was a really great and brilliant strategy. So whoever came up with that, kudos to them. That's really how you connect with people. So again, thank you for your time. I'll hand it over to Summer.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you so much for taking out time for talking to our members. I just want to also give a shout out to your staff. You know, as a government affairs person, one of the most important things is that the staff of any elected representative is very responsive, and your team is amazing. And especially Dan, Carly, and Jennifer, thank you so much for coordinating this thing with us. So once again, thank you so much, Congressman, and best of luck to everyone who's going through this, and thank you so much. Yep.
Yeah, thank you, Matt, especially both of you for those very nice words, and thanks to everyone. Please stay safe, and I look forward to gathering with you again sometime soon.
All right, great. Thanks, guys. Drop your comments into the chat, and everybody have a great and good, safe day. Take care.